Hi, Tom. I have a question that comes in two parts. I think there's a bit of a modern obsession with chasing dopamine or looking for dopamine. I also notice a lot of people self-diagnosing or perhaps really being diagnosed by a doctor that they have ADHD.
Yeah.
I'm curious on your thoughts about that and any relationship between the chasing of dopamine and are there really more people with ADHD these days? And how does meditation or can meditation play a role in either of these situations?
The thing is, dopamine is, for those who don't know, dopamine is the name of a neurotransmitter, which is a protein-like substance, and there are many such substances, all called neurotransmitters, that encapsulate how you're feeling and put it into the brain creates molecules that translate your consciousness and how it's feeling and transmit that to the body. So a neurotransmitter is the go-between between the mind and brain and biochemistry, the body, how the body is now expected to behave accordingly. And the dopamine plays a pivotal role in our capacity on a daily basis to have conceptualization. And so then its role, there's a place right in the center of the brain, the accumbens, which is one of the places where the primary detector and receptor for dopamine production occurs. And, so then people have a thought that if I have more dopamine, I'm going to feel better because it's a pleasure center. And dopamine gets into its receptor and you feel a wave of pleasure of some kind. Unless you have too much of it. If there's too much dopamine, this is what we detect in people who are suffering genetically from schizophrenia. Too much dopamine and there is over-conceptualization, where somebody might, who is neurotypical, might have a thought that hearing a fountain in the square makes them want to urinate, and maybe it'd be kind of nice to urinate in the fountain. Somebody who has too much dopamine may not be able to have the intellectual discrimination to know the difference between a kind of fanciful imaginary thought and actually carrying out the action. And they end up doing something that's socially inappropriate, and then there's social problems after that. So in schizophrenia, we regulate dopamine production by giving a phenothiazine drug that turns down dopamine production. If you turn dopamine production down too much, you get another problem, Parkinson's disease. And Parkinsonian symptomatology would include coarse tremor, loss of control over saliva and drooling, and other kinds of things and dry mouth and things like that people with Parkinson's get. So over here on this side of the spectrum, you have Parkinson's. Over here you have schizophrenia. Where is the appropriate amount of dopamine? Too much dopamine, psychopathology. Too little dopamine, neurodegenerative disease. And so then when the human intellect decides that it's going to regulate the dopamine, then we're in a very tricky territory, because the circumstances of our environment interacting with various kinds of trigger mechanisms that are already in our body will either cause dopamine to rise or fall. But if we get in there and begin tweaking it, as with most chemical phenomena in the body, there's a lot of room for human error. The idea that you can increase or tweak the dopamine levels in your brain and then get happy is a little bit like, the tail wagging the dog. Now, I always say that because I had a dog once, a little boxer who had a nipped tail. And, that tail did wag that dog. I could hold on to that little wiggly tail and the whole dog would do this. But, Cisco aside, usually the tail doesn't wag the dog. So, going into the body and adjusting the chemistry in order to set a mood state is really getting the cart before the horse, as it were. What we need to do is adjust the mood state, and then spontaneously dopamine production will self-regulate. Too much dopamine will be turned down, too little dopamine will be turned up. In other words, as hard as this is to understand for particularly Americans, I don't know why, who don't know the difference between the word maximum and the word optimum. There's only maximum. You're never going to buy a painkiller that says optimum dose. It's going to say maximum dose. We seem to always want maximum everything. And maximum very rarely matches with optimum. So optimum means the perfect amount of balance. When we practice Vedic meditation, it's been demonstrated that people who have too much dopamine, their dopamine production dials down. And people who have too little dopamine, their dopamine production ramps up, just because the mind is going to those least excited states. You go to those least excited states, you get rid of stress chemistry, and then the mind is experiencing supreme inner contentedness, and the body, instead of being, the receptor for, instead of it being loaded with stress triggers that are going to be triggered by all kinds of phenomenology in the world outside, the body then becomes the point of reference that can generate the kind of chemistry that is appropriate to the actual circumstantial need. And so we want to leave these things alone. The Vedic worldview about dopamine is, unless you are schizophrenic and being treated for too much dopamine by a psychiatrist, in which case follow the advice of the doctor, to play with dopamine as a mood-altering substance is considered to be, well, let me just put it this way, it's unnecessary. It's better to change the consciousness state first. So consciousness-driven dopamine change would be the answer of Vedic meditation. And, rather than physiologically dictated mood change caused by artificially enhancing or decreasing dopamine. So then, we want to have balance. And balance sometimes, if you're riding a bicycle, you think balance is straight up and down until you come to a curve. Now balance is way over here. That's the balance if you're going at speed around a corner. And if the curve is like that, but you're not going at speed, then balance might be less of a radical angle from 45 degrees to the horizontal. And so where is balance? Well, it's a moment by moment reality. If you try to preset balance, like you preset your bike, that it is only ever balanced up, straight up and down, the moment you come to a curve, you're going to fall off. And so once we try to rigidly create some kind of neurotransmitter function, and we don't give the brain the choice to increase or decrease, then what happens is we end up coming off the bike. We end up having some kind of a crash experience. So, consciousness-driven neurochemical change. Consciousness-driven means we go into that deep state of consciousness, change the state of consciousness, and let the neurochemicals do what they need to do to create balance instead. Now, as regards, ADHD, activity, ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and the popularity of it these days. It's that increase in the number of diagnoses of ADHD is partly because it's being measured more frequently. If you look at an era where ADHD was hardly a known thing even by most medical practitioners, you would see hardly anybody measured for it. Once you start measuring more in the general population, you're going to find a larger sample size. And then, like anything, like all neurodivergent conditions, which ADHD is, there's a spectrum. You can have 3% ADHD, or you can have 98% ADHD. It's not a black and white thing. For someone to say, I am ADHD, it might be, anything from absolute truth and, describing a grave dysfunction they have that needs to be addressed, probably with medicine and with a certain amount of therapy. Or it may be marginal ADHD, which means that it's probably not desirable to attempt to treat it with medicine. And it comes and goes. It's sometimes, very debilitating, sometimes not. But there are levels of ADHD which are non-pathological. That is to say, someone who just temporarily in the afternoon at 4 o'clock gets a little bit forgetful and a bit woozy and feels like they need to lie down for a nap or have a cup of coffee. And, for them to say, I've got ADHD, well, they probably do, maybe 2%, maybe 3%. But they'll rapidly recover from it. And so I think it's become one of those social buzzwords. I hate to say it, but I think it's true. And the reason why I hate to say it is because it takes away from the legitimacy of those who are genuinely impacted by attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or just simply AD, attention deficit disorder, ADD. Either way, somebody who's genuinely impacted at pathological levels by it, meaning disease causing, that's what pathological means. The legitimacy of their having it, if they describe it to anybody, might make somebody who's become skeptical about it or cynical about the words roll their eyes when someone says, I have ADHD. And the reaction could well be because of the overuse of the word. Everybody has ADHD, don't they? I mean, everybody's got it. And then that suddenly trivializes a genuine pathological condition that needs to be treated and needs to be taken seriously. And I think that, as with all these things, we need to develop new language, and we also need to not use psychopathological, psychophysiological pathology as kind of social media gimmicks, or things that you say at a party about yourself. As someone who is genuinely pathologically disabled by ADHD is never going to boast about it at a party. Or it's not like a badge of rank. And a lot of these things have become badges of rank. It's to me that's a bit sad, because it just means we have to invent different languages to get real. We have to start calling it something else. It's I see the same thing happening with bipolar. Once upon a time we referred to swinging emotional states as manic depressive syndrome, which was a little bit more accurate. And then, it was decided by, the wise ones that we should start calling it bipolar disorder. And now, that has also, where there may not even be a diagnosed state, it's also become a kind of a buzzword and even a little bit of a badge of rank, that it could even be used by some who are not pathologically stricken by this as an excuse not to be expected to perform to the social standard. I'm a bit bipolar. I'm a bit of an empath. I'm a bit, ADHD. I'm a bit this. I'm a bit that. And they're kind of loaded up with their badges of rank that are their ways of excusing relatively non-productive social life. To me, that's really sad because there are people who are genuinely stricken by these things, and they need to be taken seriously. So, the softening of a definition, it's just a thing that always happens in society. You start a term which is by hard, I don't mean difficult, I mean hard as in a rigorous psychiatric definition, ends up losing its edge, and it blends into a kind of a soft definition, which then is picked up as a way of protecting yourself against expectations. And I just think we need to look at that and say, well, all right, let's just invent another term for it then, until everyone starts popularizing that one or over-popularizing it. But I think that ADHD these days, including ADD, are very often, particularly in children, treated by giving them what we used to call speed, dexamphetamine. And dexamphetamine is basically speed. It's the illicit drug speed. And for reasons that nobody fully understands, it tends to allow focus to occur. Focus is a very interesting word in our society. We are indoctrinated that only focus is the correct mindset. Focus, focus, focus. And children in schools are trained, focus, focus, focus. Hey, daydreamer, you over there. That's a public shaming ritual. You looking outside at the birds over there. You have to look at the alphabet. Think A, B, say it with us, come on. Hey, daydreamer. Come on, focus, focus. And focus sounds like a lovely word, but the word focus actually has another meaning. It means to reject and to disregard anything in the periphery. It means to exclude. So exclude the birds, the beautiful birds outside the window. Attend only to the ABC. If you can't focus, is the underlying unspoken implicit message. If you can't focus, you're going to end up being a nobody. How are you going to be a productive citizen if you can't zero in and exclude? So what happens is we train people, focus, focus, focus. Focus is what it's all about. And our brain craves free-floating experience. Our brain craves being able to go lateral in our thinking. And in fact, most creatives who are earning a lot of money from being creative directors, are the kind of stereotype is sitting around in their office flying paper airplanes around the place. And while the executives who have to earn the money for the advertising company are out there, looking at the Excel spreadsheets, and the creatives off in her office or his office, kind of looking at the birds and flying airplanes and shooting BB guns at tin cans and things in their office. And people think, how can that be productive? Until they come up with a great idea, and then suddenly millions are being earned by the advertising company because the daydreamer came up with something. I'm using this as an extreme just to prove a point, and that is that defocusing is a very important experience that we have and our brain has to have. So what happens when we are indoctrinated only to focus? Our brain begins to rebel against it, and it begins to attempt to acquire the defocused state in the regular waking state. In other words, we start to daydream. Our mind begins to go lateral because it's been forced into a corral constantly since childhood. And I think that this is one of the causes of ADD, ADHD, is, the brains of modern people reacting to an extreme indoctrination that focus is the only viable human mental state. So what happens when we practice Vedic meditation? We are doing the opposite of focusing. We're settling down into a state where our awareness is allowed and entitled, it's permitted, in fact, it's even encouraged to go lateral. Vedic meditation is an anti-focus exercise. You sit in Vedic meditation and your mind goes all-inclusive and unbounded. And this is the whole idea of it, to take you out of the narrow end of the funnel of mental activity into the wide end of the funnel. So when we give ourselves a strategy every morning, every evening of defocused, blissful, supreme inner contentedness, where the mind is allowed and even encouraged to lose focus, to feel comfortable with forgetting what you're doing. One way of describing Vedic meditation. What you're normally doing is thinking, this is done, that needs to get done, that needs to get done, that needs to get done. Then you go into Vedic meditation and you're allowed to forget what you're doing until you forget to think altogether and stay conscious. That's one way of looking at it. The defocusing satisfies, it brings, to use the scientific word, it brings satiety to the brain's desire to be in a non-focused state. When the mind has had satisfaction, the brain and mind have had satisfaction during strategic periods twice every day for 20 minutes, then when you come out of Vedic meditation, the ability to focus is effortless. It's effortless because you've satisfied the brain's desire to defocus. So systematic, strategic, twice-a-day defocusing actually causes greater and more focused waking state to occur. This is all really interesting stuff. What creatives do, whether they are artists, sculptors, musicians, whatever they happen to be, their very best ideas come when they go into a kind of a state that's in between focus and not quite sleep. Going into a state where their mind and their brain are allowed to explore, and you're increasing the catchment area because there are thoughts bubbling up out of the unified field of consciousness all the time. And when you can increase the catchment area, then you're going to catch more of those thoughts. And then suddenly those are the creative impulses. Creative means something other than what you ordinarily experience. Something's only creative if it's not the same thing you experience every day. And so, for people to present to us art is supposed to always be creative, right? Painting, sculpture, music, weavings, whatever it is, whatever the medium is, whatever the format is, give me something different. When we have something different, that's creative. How are you going to come up with something different to offer to the world if you're an artist? If your mind is focused, you're in the narrow end of the funnel all the time. Not possible to have creativity in the narrow end of the funnel. That's the place for analysis. The place for synthesis is the broad place. That's where you take in lots of different things and find ways of homogenizing them, and then bringing them into a new status, a new structure, a new form of inventiveness. And our brain is designed like this. We have half of our brain, which is analytical, linear, mathematical, and so on. And then we have half of our brain that's designed to be spatial, to be aesthetic, to be synthetic, meaning the combining of different elements together. So one side of the brain is analytical, it goes for the linear, it goes for exclusion. The other side of the brain, entirely half the brain, goes for inclusion, goes for synthesis, goes for aesthetic, goes for context. The right-hand side of the brain, the left-hand side of the brain goes for content. And the right-hand side of the brain goes for context. So content and context. When you can have all these things together, you have intelligible creativity.